The mistake is small enough that neither of them notices it at first. No alarm, no warning, just a missing confirmation buried somewhere between radio static and routine paperwork. And by the time the heater begins burning fuel faster than it should, by the time the wind seals the doors with drifting snow, they are already depending on someone else to remember where they stopped. And out on the prairie, memory is as fragile as a signal. Easy to lose, impossible to recover, while two men wait in a steel car that the storm has decided not to let go. On January 18, 1967, near Minot, North Dakota, the date passes through the morning like background noise, written on a maintenance sheet, spoken once over the radio, then replaced by routine as Frank and Lowell work a standard service stop on a quiet siding, a steel rail car resting between lines, switch inspections scheduled before a freight moves through, the planes stretching flat and pale beyond the windows, open enough to make weather feel predictable. By late morning, the wind stiffens and the snow begins sliding sideways, thin at first, then steady. The forecast comes through in careful language: blowing snow, drifting likely, delays expected, nothing urgent, nothing that forces a decision. The engine idles, stumbles, then shuts down completely. Restart attempts dragging into a slow refusal, metal sounding heavy and wrong, cold settling into parts that should still move. They step outside once to assess, and the storm answers immediately. Visibility collapsing within a few steps, the track dissolving into white motion, the service car shrinking behind them, snow cutting exposed skin. Wind strong enough to force a lean. Lowell reaches for the handrail and misses because distance has turned unreliable, and they retreat without argument because the land has already made its position clear. Inside, the problem becomes measurable. Diesel in the heater tank, battery strength already dipping, water meant for a single shift, canned food packed for convenience, flares that require clear air, rags, tape, a lantern, tools that suddenly feel conditional. Frank runs the heater and watches the flame closely. Lowell cracks a vent and listens for the exhaust outside, both understanding the same rule without saying it. Warmth buys time, but it also spends fuel, and fuel spent early is gone forever. As afternoon fades, the snow stacks higher on the leeward side of the car, pressing into seams, altering airflow, whispering through gaps as fine powder. They seal one place and worry about another. The radio fills with distant voices and nearer emergencies that are not theirs, and when they finally get an answer, it is not rescue, only instruction to hold position, as if position is fixed, as if the prairie is not already shifting it inch by inch, quietly, patiently, while survival settles in without ceremony. Night settles without ceremony, not a clear moment, but a gradual loss of contrast. The windows turning from white to darker white, and inside the railcar the cold begins to feel intentional, like something adjusting its grip. Frank shuts the heater down earlier than planned, and the silence that follows is heavy. Every tick of cooling metal suddenly loud. Lowell keeps his gloves on even while counting supplies again, because bare skin feels like a risk now. They agree on a schedule without writing it down. Heat in short bursts. Radio checks spaced wider apart. Movement kept minimal. The idea is simple. Make fewer mistakes by doing less. But the body resists stillness. Fingers stiffen, legs cramp, and every small discomfort tempts a bad decision. Sometime after midnight, the wind changes pitch, not stronger, just sharper, and snow begins forcing its way through a seam near the floor, fine as dust, collecting in a thin white line along the wall. Frank packs it with rags and tape, presses hard, then waits to see if it holds. Lowell watches the vent outside through a frost-rimmed window, because exhaust behavior matters now. The wrong drift in the wrong place could turn heat into poison. They argue briefly about running the heater longer to dry the air, then stop, because arguing wastes warmth, and silence becomes another resource they try not to spend. The radio crackles once, strong enough to lift both their heads, then dissolves into static again. Frank taps the casing, adjusts the dial, transmits their position slowly, clearly, waits. Nothing comes back, and the absence lands harder than bad news would have, because silence suggests they are not a priority, or worse, not clearly located. Lowell checks the battery voltage and does the math out loud. Numbers that shrink if repeated too often. They decide to power the radio only on the hour. A rule that feels reasonable until you imagine missing the one call that matters. Cold creeps inward by degrees. The kind you notice only when it has already claimed something. Frank realizes his boots are stiffening. Lowell notices his breath fogging thicker than before. They shift weight, stamp lightly, careful not to sweat, because dampness is a debt with interest. The heater comes on for 5 minutes, the flame steady but smaller than earlier, both men watching it like it might confess something. Then off again, the quiet rushing back in, full of wind and distant movement that may or may not be snow against steel. By early morning, the storm shows no sign of thinning. The snow line on the door has climbed higher, pressing with more confidence now. The world outside reduced to force without shape, and inside the railcar survival becomes procedural, almost boring if you don't look too closely, eat slowly, drink carefully, move deliberately, wait for the next hour mark. Because the most dangerous thought is not fear, it is the idea that this will end soon. And as Frank resets the radio timer and Lowell adjusts the vent by a fraction, both men understand the same quiet truth. They are no longer waiting for rescue. They are maintaining a system. And systems fail only when attention slips. Morning does not arrive so much as leak in through thinner darkness, a gray suggestion behind iced glass. And with it comes the first real complication. The heater refuses to relight on the second attempt, the flame sputtering and dying as if starved. Frank waits, counts, tries again. This time it holds but weaker, smaller, and they exchange a look that carries more weight than words, because machines do not improve on their own in cold. Like this, they only reveal what is already wrong. Lowell notes the fuel level and does not say the number out loud, because speaking it would make it final. The wind pushes snow higher along the sidewall, enough that the door seal groans under pressure, fine powder seeping in despite their efforts, collecting along the floor where boots drag it into slush. Frank scrapes ice from the inside of the window to check the vent outside and sees the drift has climbed nearly to the exhaust outlet. He opens the exterior hatch a fraction to clear it, and the wind slams it shut hard enough to rattle the frame. They wedge it open with a tool handle, then stand still and listen, because every adjustment now has consequences that might not show themselves immediately. The radio comes alive without warning, a burst of overlapping voices, clipped, urgent, then gone again. Frank catches a fragment about blocked lines west of them. Lowell hears something about a plow delayed by visibility. Neither hears their own call sign, and the silence that follows feels heavier than before, because it confirms what they have both been circling. Help is moving, but not toward them yet, and movement elsewhere does not warm this car or clear this drift. Hunger announces itself in small ways, a hollow feeling that sharpens concentration and then dulls it. They eat half portions, chewing slowly, washing it down with careful sips. Lowell rubs feeling back into his fingers and stops when his hands begin to sweat. Frank shifts position to ease a cramp and worries about the energy spent doing it. The heater runs for 4 minutes, then off. The flame noticeably smaller now, and the quiet that returns feels colder than before, as if the car remembers warmth and resents its absence. By midday, the storm has not broken. The sky remains sealed, the snow no longer falling in flakes but flowing, relentless, shaping the world without pause. And inside the railcar, the balance grows tighter, fuel versus heat, air versus exhaust, movement versus moisture. Frank adjusts the radio timer and hesitates, then widens the interval. Lowell marks time by watching condensation freeze and thaw on the wall, and neither man says what they are both thinking, that the margin for error is thinning, and that surviving now depends less on endurance than on not making the one small decision that tips everything the wrong way. The failure announces itself quietly, not with a bang or a smell. Just a change in behavior that Frank notices because he has been watching the heater too closely. The flame no longer steady even in short bursts, fluttering as if unsure it wants to stay. And when it cuts out on its own before the timer, the silence that follows feels deliberate. Lowell waits a full minute before trying the restart, because rushing machines in cold like this only makes things worse. The second ignition holds, barely, and they agree without speaking to shorten every cycle from here on. Fewer minutes of heat, longer stretches of cold, the kind of adjustment that feels manageable until you live inside it. Snow pressure increases along the sidewall, the car groaning softly as if settling. Fine powder works its way in again near the floor, turning packed rags damp and heavy. Frank replaces them with dry cloth and shifts the old ones closer to the heater to reclaim what warmth they can. Lowell checks the exhaust vent again and finds it partially buried, the drift having crept higher while they were focused inside. He clears it with a shovel through the hatch in short, violent motions, retreating each time the wind slams the door back toward him, and when he finally seals it again, his hands shake from effort and cold. A reminder that going outside costs more now than it did yesterday. The radio crackles with a brief transmission meant for someone else. A crew reporting visibility near zero, progress measured in yards. Frank responds immediately, repeats their position, waits, and hears nothing back. The silence stretching long enough to make him check the battery again. Lowell suggests conserving power further, cutting checks to every 2 hours, and the suggestion lands hard because it feels like giving up information, like choosing ignorance. But they both know that a dead radio helps no one, and rules are only useful if they can be maintained. Fatigue settles in unevenly. Not sleepiness, but a dull drag on thought. Frank catches himself staring at the same spot on the wall for too long. Lowell miscounts a can and has to start over. They force themselves into small tasks, reorganizing supplies that do not need reorganizing, reviewing their schedule aloud, touching base just to confirm the other is still tracking time, because isolation inside a small space can grow teeth if left alone. By late afternoon, the storm remains unchanged, the outside world reduced to pressure and sound, and inside the railcar the margin tightens again, the heater flame smaller than it was that morning, the fuel gauge dipping into territory they had hoped not to see until later. Frank resets the timer with care. Lowell adjusts the vent by a fraction, and both men understand the shift that has occurred. This is no longer about waiting out weather. It is about outlasting a system that is slowly degrading, part by part, decision by decision, with no clear signal for when the next adjustment will be the one that matters most. The cold becomes personal overnight. No longer just something they manage, but something that reacts, tightening when they still, easing only when they move just enough. Frank wakes from shallow sleep with his jaw clenched so hard it aches. Lowell sits upright, rubbing his calves because cramps have turned sharp. Insistent. They compare symptoms quietly, because naming problems can make them feel larger. The heater comes on for a shorter cycle than planned, and the flame barely stabilizes. Both men watching it with the same thought, that it looks like something being kept alive rather than something doing its job. Sometime before dawn, a new sound joins the storm. A low, irregular creak along the undercarriage. Not constant, not rhythmic, just enough to pull attention every time it happens. Lowell guesses shifting snow load. Frank guesses temperature stress in the steel. Neither explanation is comforting. They check the door seal again and find ice thick enough to resist pressure, meaning if they had to leave quickly, it would cost time they do not have. Frank chips at it carefully and stops when his fingers go numb through gloves, understanding that breaking too much could make it worse later. The radio check brings nothing but static, and this time the silence feels different, not empty but distant, like shouting into fog. Lowell suggests moving the car's exterior marker flag to a higher point for visibility if the storm thins. Frank agrees but insists it wait until conditions improve, because going outside now risks more than it gains. The discussion stays calm, but underneath it is the growing awareness that opportunities are shrinking, that each option has a window, and windows close without announcement. Hunger dulls and sharpens them in turns. They split another half portion and force themselves to eat slowly, water measured by capfuls. Lowell laughs once at something minor and stops immediately, surprised by the sound, because laughter feels like it belongs to a different life. Frank stretches his shoulders and feels a pop that makes him freeze, checking for pain, then relief, then worry about how fragile everything feels now, including themselves. By mid-morning, the storm finally changes, not ending, but shifting, the wind backing off just enough to reveal depth outside the window, vague shapes where there were none before, snow still moving but less violently. Frank notes the time and resists the urge to celebrate. Lowell clears the exhaust vent again and finds it easier than before, a small improvement that feels dangerous because it tempts optimism. They stick to the schedule, conserve fuel, conserve words, because both men understand the same thing now. Survival is not about hope or toughness, it is about discipline, and discipline is hardest to keep when the situation almost, but not quite, starts to improve. The brief easing does not last, it never does, and by afternoon the wind returns with a narrower focus, pushing snow in hard lines that scrape along the car's side like tools. Frank notices the temperature inside dropping faster between heater cycles, a steeper curve than before, which means insulation is losing the fight. Lowell presses a hand to the wall and pulls it back immediately. Surprised by how much cold the steel is bleeding inward now, they shorten the heat bursts again and accept the shivering as part of the cost, because fuel has become the more fragile thing. A new problem announces itself without drama: condensation freezing along the ceiling, then loosening in small, icy drops that fall and melt on contact, turning patches of the floor damp. Lowell spreads rags and repositions gear to keep boots dry. Frank shifts their remaining water to a higher shelf away from the coldest spots, because freezing would turn control into chance. They work slowly, deliberately, knowing that bending too much or too fast invites sweat, and sweat is a debt they cannot repay. The radio finally brings a voice meant for them, distorted but real, a dispatcher asking for status. Frank answers immediately, gives their location twice, slower the second time. There is a pause long enough to make both men lean toward the speaker. Then a response comes back thin and uncertain. Acknowledgement without promise. Mention of crews still delayed, conditions improving unevenly. The word tomorrow floating without weight. When the transmission ends, the silence feels different, heavier in a way that suggests they have been seen but not reached. A halfway state that is harder than being forgotten. Fatigue deepens into something trickier, not just tiredness, but errors at the edges. Frank catches himself reaching for the heater switch out of habit instead of schedule. Lowell misjudges the vent opening and corrects it a second too late. They stop and reset, reviewing rules aloud like trainees. Heat on time, radio on the hour, food measured, movement minimal. The ritual itself becoming a brace against the mind slipping, because cold does not rush. It waits for lapses. As night approaches again, the storm's sound changes, less chaotic, more distant, but the cold sharpens, the outside temperature dropping enough that breath fogs thick and fast. The heater flame is now visibly smaller than it was yesterday, and the fuel gauge sits lower than either man wants to acknowledge. Frank adjusts the timer with care. Lowell checks the door seal one more time, and both men feel the same pressure settle in. The window for easy survival has closed. What remains is balance, and balance only holds as long as nothing new demands attention at the wrong moment. The night presses harder than the ones before it. Not louder, not angrier, just colder. The kind of cold that sharpens edges and makes small movements feel expensive. Frank notices it first in his hands, stiffness that doesn't fully leave even after a heat cycle. Lowell feels it in his feet, pins and needles that refuse to settle. They trade places, trade tasks, anything to keep circulation honest, because stillness now feels like surrender, and neither man is ready for that. A subtle change in the car's posture becomes impossible to ignore. Not a shift you can see, but one you feel through the floor. A slight unevenness underfoot as snow load redistributes along the sidewall. Lowell crouches and presses his palm to the steel, feeling vibration where there should be none. Frank checks the door seal again and finds it bowed inward by pressure, ice thickening along the edge. They chip carefully, knowing that freeing it too much could invite new problems. Every action weighed against what it might break later. The radio brings another fragment of the outside world, clearer this time. A plow crew reporting progress measured in miles instead of yards. Frank answers immediately, repeats their location, adds a description of the siding and nearby markers. The reply comes back strained but real. Acknowledgement again. Reassurance without commitment. Conditions improving but slow. When the transmission ends, Lowell exhales a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Relief tempered by the understanding that being known does not mean being reached soon. Inside, the system tightens further. Heat cycles shortened again. Food reduced to the bare minimum needed to keep thought sharp. Water rationed more strictly now that freezing threatens the container seals. Frank marks time by scratching lines into a notebook margin. Lowell by counting heater clicks. Both methods imperfect but better than guessing. Fatigue lurks at the edges. Not enough to sleep. Just enough to dull reaction. And they speak more often now, checking each other's focus. Because silence can hide mistakes. As the long night stretches toward morning, the storm finally loosens its grip, not fully releasing them, but easing enough to reveal depth outside the windows, faint outlines where nothing existed before, the wind dropping to a steady push instead of a shove. Frank notes the change and resists the urge to adjust anything too quickly. Lowell clears the exhaust vent and finds less resistance, a small victory that feels fragile. They hold to the schedule. Hold to restraint, because both men know the same thing now. Rescue is no longer a question of if, but when. And the danger lies in spending too much of themselves before that moment finally arrives. The first real sign arrives quietly. So quietly, Frank almost dismisses it as imagination. A distant mechanical hum threaded through the wind, intermittent, fading in and out. Lowell hears it too a moment later, and they both freeze, afraid to move in case movement steals it away. They listen with everything they have left, counting seconds between gusts, trying to separate hope from sound. The hum returns, stronger this time, then vanishes again. Not close, not certain, but real enough to change the air inside the car because now waiting has a direction. They argue in low voices about signaling, flares versus conserving supplies. Visibility versus wind direction. Frank worries about wasting the last good flare in blowing snow. Lowell worries about missing the one moment someone might actually see it. They compromise the way exhausted people do, preparing everything without committing. A flare placed near the door. Lantern checked and repositioned. The exterior marker adjusted higher using a pole through the hatch. Every movement slow and careful, because clumsiness now would cost more than time. Cold makes one last push, the temperature inside dropping sharply between heat cycles, breath fog thickening, joints aching with a deep, persistent throb. Frank's fingers feel slow, as if wrapped in layers that aren't there. Lowell catches himself shivering harder than before and forces stillness, because shivering burns fuel the body cannot replace easily. They run the heater for a slightly longer cycle than planned and watch the gauge dip, accepting the trade without comment, because staying sharp matters more now than later. The radio crackles again, clearer than before. A dispatcher calling their unit directly. Frank answers immediately. Voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Confirmation comes back fast this time. A plow crew within reach. Visibility improving by the mile. Lowell closes his eyes for a moment and lets the words settle. Not relief yet, not celebration, just a narrowing of the problem, because rescue still requires them to hold together long enough to be found. As the night edges toward morning, the wind continues to ease, snow movement slowing from flow to drift, shapes outside gaining definition. Frank keeps his eyes on the window. Lowell keeps his on the heater, both men locked into their roles, the flare still untouched by the door. the system still intact, and in that careful balance they understand the danger has shifted again. The storm is loosening, help is moving, and now the greatest risk is not cold or fuel or silence, but making a final mistake in the last stretch, when endurance feels almost, but not quite, rewarded. The sound returns with purpose this time, not a hum that comes and goes, but a steady mechanical grind carried on calmer air, close enough now that neither man doubts it. Frank grips the edge of the table to keep from moving too fast. Lowell leans toward the window and wipes a clear patch in the frost, watching shapes take form where the storm once erased everything. A dark line where tracks should be, a moving shadow beyond it, the knowledge of help. This close changes the pressure inside the car immediately. Urgency replacing patience, because now every decision has a visible consequence. They move with care, born of exhaustion, not rushing, not hesitating. Lowell opens the hatch just enough to test the wind and finds it manageable. Frank readies the flare but waits, counting the seconds between gusts. The heater is shut down completely now to save what little fuel remains, the cold sharp and immediate but acceptable. They check the vent one last time and clear it fully, because the smell of exhaust now would be unforgivable. Outside, the engine noise grows louder, then fades slightly as if adjusting course, uncertainty spiking again. Frank fires the flare on the next lull, the light violent and brief in the gray air, smoke dragged sideways but visible, both men watching through the window until it burns out, heartbeats loud enough to feel. A pause follows that stretches too long. Then the sound changes, closer, more deliberate. Lowell lets out a breath that turns into a cough he quickly suppresses, because even relief feels dangerous until it is confirmed. The radio crackles with a voice they recognize, clearer than it has ever been. Confirmation of visual contact, instructions to remain inside, the plow approaching slowly due to drift depth. Frank answers once, calmly, then shuts the radio off to preserve the battery for nothing more. They sit back, suddenly aware of how much their bodies hurt, fingers numb, joints aching, eyes burning from constant focus. But the system holds. Nothing fails. Nothing is asked of them except to wait a little longer. As the plow draws near, the railcar trembles, not from wind, but from proximity. Steel answering steel. Snow pushed aside in heavy waves. The door remains sealed for now. Heat absent, but unnecessary, because survival has narrowed to minutes, not hours. Frank and Lowell exchange a look that carries everything they have not said for days, understanding that the danger is not gone yet, but it is finally moving away. And all that remains is to stay intact until the outside world finishes the last careful steps toward them. The impact is gentle but unmistakable, a deep vibration through the floor as the plow makes contact with packed snow along the siding, steel answering steel in a way that feels almost conversational. Frank braces himself instinctively while Lowell grips the edge of the bench, the railcar shuddering as pressure eases along one side, then the other, snow peeling away in heavy slabs that fall with dull thuds, light finding new angles through the windows, the world outside gaining shape, color, depth, not freedom yet, but possibility. And when the grinding noise cuts out and is replaced by human voices muffled through wind, both men realize how long it has been since they heard anyone close. They wait, as instructed, because discipline does not vanish just because help has arrived. Footsteps crunch near the door, tools scrape at ice seals, a voice calls out their unit number. Frank answers once, loud and steady, and there is a pause while the last resistance is worked free. The door finally opening with a long metallic complaint. Cold air rushing in sharper than anything they have felt before, but clean, unmistakably safe. The outside crew's faces rimmed with frost, eyes scanning quickly, professionally, checking posture, speech, awareness, relief held back until assessment is done. Lowell is helped down first, legs stiff but holding. Frank follows more slowly, pausing at the threshold to look back once at the interior that kept them alive. The heater cold and spent, the rags frozen in place. The careful order still intact. He steps onto cleared ground, and the sensation is almost disorienting. Space without walls, sound without confinement. The storm reduced to background weather instead of an opponent. They are wrapped in blankets, guided toward warmth, questions asked and answered in short exchanges. Nothing dramatic, just confirmation that endurance has been enough. As they are led toward the waiting engine, the plow operator mentions how close the call was, how another hour of drifting might have sealed the sighting completely. Frank nods without comment. Lowell exhales and lets the tension drain for the first time in days, and as the railcar fades behind them, already beginning to look ordinary again, both men understand something they will never need to say out loud. Survival did not arrive in a single moment of rescue. It arrived through 100 small choices made correctly when no one was watching, and when the door finally closed behind them, it was not the end of the storm that mattered most, but the fact that they were still there to walk away from it. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.